The decline in quality of Game of Thrones as seasons progressed was noticed by more hardcore book fans as it was happening, while for more casual audience it was a much more gradual process, with most noticing a drop in the writing quality around season 6 and 7, with some not really having any issue until the now infamous season 8. I think at the time I was somewhere in the middle, where I started to notice things had begun to decline in terms of writing around season 6. But a long time ago, I made a video where I argued the signs of the decline could be spotted as early as season 4. In the end, this all accumulated with the questionable final season of the show, with showrunners David Benioff and DB Weiss rightly taking a lot of flack for their creative decisions and changes to the source material. Unlike recent cases with House of the Dragon and Ryan Condal and George R.R. Martin's public fallout, Benioff and Weiss seemed to take the wave of criticism in silence in the wake of season 8, almost entirely leaving the public eye while they worked on their next projects, even turning down the offer of an executive producer credit for House of the Dragon. George R.R. Martin would even defend the showrunners when a petition for season 8 to be remade hit mainstream news. Part of the reason many fans speculated that George never really spoke out against Benioff and Weiss the way he has done with Ryan Condal and season 2 of House of the Dragon is the fact that he might partly feel responsible for a lot of the changes Benioff and Weiss needed to make to Game of Thrones due to him not completing the book series. When George talked about the changes the show made from the books, he always seemed to try and put a positive spin on it, and in many ways was supportive of them and the show's right to do them. But it's clear that did seem to change after season 4 of the show, with George taking a step back from the writer's room. It's suggested and hinted at, even by the man himself, that is where the working relationship with Benioff and Weiss started to sour, with the showrunners cutting Lady Stoneheart, and the fact, in his view, Books 4 and 5 of A Song of Ice and Fire, A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons were going to be adapted in one season, with George feeling like it had enough content to cover 3. Thus the show would catch up to the books 2 years sooner than he had anticipated. Not that that would really end up mattering much, as we're still here waiting for the Winds of Winter. But here's the thing, I was shocked, and it seems the wider fandom was shocked as well. Benioff and Weiss were going to cover A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons in a single season, which would mean cutting huge chunks of the story, and I think personally in retrospect, it's what led to the downturn in quality we saw post season 5. But here's the thing, and it's a sentiment I've seen growing in popularity in the last few months, that maybe merging A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, cutting so much content, might have been the single best decision Benioff and Weiss made in regard to protecting the practical production of the show. Those 2 books added so many new plot threads and ended in a very complex situation in Essos and Westeros, a situation we know George has had trouble writing around and working out, which has influenced the delays with Winds of Winter. In this video, we're going to be discussing the impact of this decision and analysing the idea that if George had not added all these new characters and plot lines, that we may actually be sat here today with a finished book series. Benioff and Weiss simplified the narrative greatly, but was that actually the best thing for the health of the show? When I first read A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, especially Feast, I found it very jarring for one simple reason. If we view the end of A Storm of Swords as the end of Act 1, Feast and Dance are Act 2. While these books do continue the story of the characters that were established in the prior books, Feast and Dance add 14 new point-of-view characters between the 2 books, with several of these being brand new characters that had not been established in prior books. As part of this, the Ironborn, Dorne and Essos story is greatly expanded, with the likes of Ariane Martell, Aereo Hota, Quinton Martell, Aeron Greyjoy, Victorian Greyjoy, and John Connington, among others. It's almost this huge reset point in the story with how many new characters we get to know and storylines to develop, all the while mixing in and slowly developing the characters and storylines that already existed prior. Needless to say, the first time I read the book I found it overwhelming and really didn't enjoy or appreciate the Dornish and Ironborn stories. In fact, I was just wanting to get back to what I saw as the main plot with Dany, Jon and Tyrion and so forth. But as soon as my first reread of the books, I saw what these storylines offered and have come to love them, with some of the Dornish chapters among my favourite in the whole series. The addition of so much new stuff halfway through the story was a bold move by George R.R. Martin, and you can tell as early as A Feast for Crows he was starting to struggle with the blooming size of the story. In my head, I kind of view A Feast and Dance as one single huge book, because in a lot of ways, it is. The events in both books, for the most part, tend to happen at the same time, but they are simply split by location, and is how you end up with the likes of Jon, Dany and Tyrion entirely omitted from Feast, with much of the story focusing on King's Landing, the Riverlands, the Iron Islands and Dorne. Now, given how big the story had grown, George really had no choice but to split the book by location. There are many different chapter orders out there if you want to try and read both Feast and Dance as one big book, but I must admit, while it's interesting, it has its own set of problems when trying to order the chapters by timeline. There are points where a storyline or a chapter would be left hanging for hundreds of pages before it's picked up again, then subsequently dropped again for another 100 pages. It does give us a clearer timeline of how it all fits together, but the pacing is all over the place, and splitting the book by location allows some semblance of structure, but it also raises a very fair question. Did the addition of the new content have a negative impact on the wider story and create a circumstance that has led to George R.R. Martin's writer's block and lack of Winds of Winter as a result? Did he simply create a situation where he can't finish the story because there's simply too many loose ends and moving parts to align? Because if this is the case for George, which it seems to be, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss never truly had a hope in hell of actually being able to adapt past Feast and Dance, move towards an ending, especially when they were running out of source material to adapt at the same time. If George still wasn't 100% sure how these new storylines work within the conclusion of the series, adapting them to screen would have been the blind leading the blind in a lot of ways. It is possible that the story had just grown too big, and George lost control of it, thanks to all of these new additions. Season 5 is still very much within the book, for the most part. The very first scene of the season and the very last scene of the season are book scenes. It's more Season 6 that's going to be diverging a bit. We've had a lot of conversations with George, and he makes a lot of stuff up as he's writing. Even while we talk to him about the ending, it doesn't mean that the ending that he has currently conceived is going to be the ending he eventually writes. It's like looking at the landscape and saying, okay, there's a mountain over there. I know I'm getting to that mountain. There's an event that's going to happen, and I know that I'm moving in the general direction of the event. But what's between where I'm standing now and that thing off in the horizon? I'm not totally sure. I know when I get there, and I'll see how the terrain looks like around me, and I'll choose my path once I get closer. He figures a lot of stuff out as he goes. He always says he's a gardener, not an architect. Benioff and Weiss in an interview with Variety in 2015. George R.R. Martin has been very outspoken about the difficulties he's had with writing The Winds of Winter, with a lot of that as a result of his abandoned planned 5-year time jump at the end of A Storm of Swords, which means he now has to adjust how his story developed and also requires the expansion of the story with the likes of Dorne and the Ironborn. We know he particularly had a tough time with Essos in A Dance with Dragons, which has infamously been named the Myronese Knot, something he's spoken about at length in his Knot-a-blog back in 2012. George stated the following: all of these things were balls I had thrown up in the air, and they're all linked and chronologically entwined. The return of Drogon to the city was something I explored as happening at different times. For example, I wrote 3 different versions of Quinton's arrival at Meereen. One where he arrives long before Dany's marriage, one where he arrives much later, and one where he arrived just days before the marriage, which is how it ended up being in the novel. And I had to write all 3 versions to be able to compare and see how these different arrival points affect the stories of other characters, including the stories of a character who actually hasn't arrived yet. A lot of the issues he had with A Dance with Dragons and A Feast for Crows were a result of the aborted time jump and the extreme expansion of the story in A Feast for Crows. This has all impacted the writings of The Winds of Winter, where in blog posts over the last few years and some offhand comments at conventions, it appears his story has gotten so big with the additions in Feast and Dance that he's struggling to bring it all together for Act 3 in these last 2 books. I believe he struggled so much with the sheer scale of the story has grown to, and he's almost lost control over it, and thus why the Winds of Winter has taken so long, and frankly may never happen. Therefore, a popular idea that has emerged in the last couple of years is while the result of the cuts Benioff and Weiss made were poor, by cutting the bulk of the new content added in Feast and Dance, Dorne, the Ironborn, John Connington, they were able to avoid the issues George created by expanding the story and thus reach some sort of ending for the TV show, even if that ending itself was in the end poorly executed. I think there's a lot of validity to this idea, and some aspects of it which are a bit reaching. Game of Thrones' first 2 seasons covered a book apiece, with season 3 and 4 covering Storm of Swords due to its huge size. The consensus among many fans, and even George himself, is there was enough content to cross both A Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons for 3 seasons for Game of Thrones. But this was what most fans and George expected was going to happen, so it was a bit of a huge shock come season 5 that Benioff and Weiss had merged both books and effectively covered 3 seasons worth of content in a single season, with much being cut as a result, and the story dramatically shifting from the books as well. While, as it stands, The Winds of Winter is 13 years late, we do have to remember that back in 2014, we genuinely had reason to hope it was only a couple of years away. The most common fan take is the show got bad after they ran out of books, and whilst that is true to some degree, it indeed happened long before that, with the decline starting with them covering 2 books in 1 season. If they did indeed cover Feast and Dance in 3 seasons as George had wanted, they would have not have run out of book material until 2017-ish. While Benioff and Weiss would still have to end the show on their own, at least in this timeline they had all the pieces they needed to do so, and not force other characters down parts of the story where they were never meant to be. In season 5 and 6 we did get a very watered down version of the Dornish and Ironborn plotlines, with the Dornish effectively being cut altogether for the most part, and the Ironborn only having a passing similarity to the book. The likes of John Connington and several other Essos plot threads were also completely abandoned, and even storylines involving the likes of Sansa and Arya Stark were drastically altered. While I personally hate that they did this, I do think there's some actual valid reasons why you can argue that Benioff and Weiss had their hand forced somewhat when it came to this, with there being many factors outside of their control. It may have been the point of view of Benioff and Weiss and HBO that the only way to ensure the show got made and was actually profitable was this course of action. In an interview with Variety in 2015, Benioff and Weiss stated the following: "I really think it gives us an insight into their thought process and logic when approaching the writing of season 5. One of the most common questions we get asked is, why did you change this from the book? The answer is always the same, really. It's just because we thought it would be better for the series. Some of them are really fun characters, but we already have the largest cast I think in television history, and seems just to grow every year. Fact is, we can't possibly have all the characters from the books. It would start to sink beneath its own weight. We have different coloured index cards. We have to search for all of these weird coloured cards. Each colour signifies one storyline. We have to go to Office Max flagship store, the only place where they carry yellow polka dotted index cards, because we run through every conceivable colour. At a certain point, maybe the show can carry 13 separate story threads, but it can't carry 24. I don't want to shortchange Arya because 15 other characters in a whole other country that we need to spend time with. So what I want to do is take a moment to analyse this quote, because it highlights some key factors that definitely influence Benioff and Weiss' choice to cover Feast and Dance in a single season. And some of this argument can be strongly justified from a television production standpoint. First off, it's typical that the longer a show tends to run, the more it costs to make. For example, cast contracts get renegotiated. Newer cast members tend to be paid more in comparison to early seasons. The scale of the story means the budget balloons, especially with shows like Game of Thrones, where things only get more epic and large scale as we get to the conclusion of the story. I mean, we lacked direwolves in season 6 onwards, simply because of the sheer cost of the CGI for the dragons. It all snowballs. Without the merger of A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, the final season of Game of Thrones, the much loathed season 8, came out in 2019 at a cost of an estimated $90 million for the 6 episodes. Now, I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think that figure includes cast wages and bonuses, which by season 8 for some key cast members, according to reports in The Standard, were as high as $1.2 million per episode. If the show had run 2 extra seasons until 2021, it is very likely that figure would not only have been higher, but the cast itself would have been even larger as well. Then of course, that 90 million production budget for the 6-episode season 8 would have also likely been much higher as well. Let's not even get into the impact COVID would have had on production. But you can see the problem here. Yes, Game of Thrones was a highly profitable show for HBO, but as we've seen with countless other shows and movies, if costs get too high and eat away at your margins, the profit may fall low enough that it's simply not worth spending the money to make the show in the first place. It's why it's very rare for most TV shows to go past 5 seasons, let alone 10, where viewing numbers really would have to be high enough to justify it. Again, we have another quote from the same EW interview that really gets across how Benioff and Weiss were aware of the butterfly effect of cutting these characters and the impact it has, but also the general ethos when it comes to adaptation. I think every season has been a little bit more. The first season was extremely faithful. The second season had a few more deviations. Each season has had to do a little bit more. If we were to remain entirely faithful to A Feast for Crows, half the characters, the most popular characters, would be absent from the screen this season. It's always been about adapting the series as a whole and following the map George laid out for us and hitting the major milestones, but not necessarily each of the stops along the way. It's an adaptation. It will have to adapt in order to survive. There are always going to be some people who want everything to remain exactly as the books. For us, it was never a choice. This is the riskiest season from a storytelling perspective, and certainly the most difficult. We were faced with adapting 2 huge books and following on arcs and themes that were certainly inspired by the books, were a little more its own thing. So what this interview extract really shows us is the issue of the cast's screen time, and the fact that cutting characters was never a choice in the showrunner's opinion. It's something in their view they have to do. Often in contracts there are clauses that an actor will be guaranteed a certain amount of episodes per season, or a certain amount of screen time per season. In a way, this is to protect the actor. They could agree a salary of say $100,000 an episode, then the show could only use them for 1 or 2. The actor makes less money, but it could also stunt their career, as they could have been doing other projects as well, instead of booking out a whole production period for the show. Typically, these things are known so far in advance, however, that is rarely an issue. Game of Thrones Season 5 saw the absence of Bran Stark, played by Isaac Hampstead Wright. David Benioff told EW in an interview in 2015 about the omission. It was due to the fact they'd almost caught up with Bran's book plot in Season 5, and thus he was way ahead of the other characters in his story, timeline-wise. To keep it parallel with the others, they had to cut him from Season 5. And this worked okay for 1 or 2 actors, none of whom were apparent big earners of the cast. But the problem of a merged Feast for Crows Dance with Dragons faces is due to the way the timeline would pan out. There would have been many key cast members who would only appear maybe 1 or 2 episodes per season due to the expansion of the story in such a huge way. This wouldn't have just been an issue for 1 or 2 cast members, but a majority of the established cast. I suspect this would have breached several contracts in regards to screen time, and I'm not sure the actors themselves would have been thrilled at the idea of being sidelined. A few may have been happy to take time off to do other projects, but the truth is, with the sheer numbers we're talking about, it would have been a logistical nightmare. You also have to consider you'd be casting maybe 15 to 20 new actors, who would be needing as much screen time as the main cast to establish their story and characters. Also consider this, we as book fans who knew this was going to happen probably would have been okay with it, but I suspect the show's ratings may have taken a huge hit in terms of general audience if they weren't seeing their fan favourite characters every week. The general audience isn't going to care about Arianne Martell or Aeron Greyjoy if they're losing Daenerys and Tyrion as a result. It's kind of like how a lot of book fans first reacted when reading A Feast of Crows for the first time. It would have been very jarring for them, with it maybe being viewed more positive upon a rewatch. But by that point, the damage would have been done in terms of HBO's bottom line. But introducing all these new additional plotlines and characters would have greatly impacted the pace of the show as well, with so many new elements needing to be established. The show would have needed to have returned to a more slow burn pace of say Season 1, which I suspect was a matter of concern for the executives of HBO, given the show's growing reputation for its fast moving plot, with lots of twists and turns, red wedding-like moments, in a universe where they did cover the book in 3 seasons. I'm not sure what your episode 9 event would have been in Season 5, or where you could clearly have ended the season. In a merged story, A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons is very back-end heavy when it comes to those kinds of events. Something had to give. Benioff and Weiss were presented 3 ways forward. Attempt to find a way to make Feast and Dance work on a practical level over 3 seasons, something which I don't think they ever intended to do, given their insistence the show needed to end with Season 8. With this Season 8 cutoff, you're not going to be able to cover Feast, Dance, and the 2 as yet unpublished books in 30 episodes of TV. They could then simply cut huge chunks of the new material added into the books in the form of Dorne, the Ironborn, and John Connington, and attempt to adjust the ending accordingly. Something that frankly may never have been possible, given we don't know the impact these storylines have in future books. Or you could try what the show attempted, a lightweight version of these stories with some similar elements, but ultimately are original to the show. Thus, how we ended up with 2 books covered in a single season, with a very slimmed down version of the story, much of which would later be abandoned entirely as soon as it was convenient for the show. It solved the practical production issues side of the problem, at the expense of the story they were trying to tell. Now, I don't personally agree with Benioff and Weiss' choice to take this approach, because the sheer butterfly effect it has on the ending. I think huge parts of the issue with the ending of the show have their origin with this moment. It's very clear from interviews with Benioff and Weiss. The main motivation for making Game of Thrones was to adapt the Red Wedding. It very much seems that after that, they lost a lot of the passion for the project. I think the energy it took to make those first 4 seasons and the monumental task of adapting A Song of Ice and Fire burnt them out. And we must also remember that they weren't exactly prolific screenwriters to begin with. They were more executive producers. You really can see a night and day difference in how they speak in interviews about the show post-season 4 when compared to the first 4 seasons. I genuinely don't think they wanted to make the show anymore, hence why they insisted on ending it after 8 seasons, which is why they chose the path of least resistance when deciding to condense Feast and Dance, to try and take that shortcut. Despite how logistically hard it would have been to adapt, I think if Benioff and Weiss had stepped aside into a more executive producer role and let a new team of writers with fresh energy and passion take over showrunning and writing aspects of the project, they could have made it work. This was Game of Thrones after all, the most popular show for a decade, and with unimaginable worldwide audience. A show, despite its production costs, was printing money for HBO. Pay the cast what they needed, negotiate the contracted screen time. If any show could have pulled it off, it would have been Game of Thrones. But the sad reality is, I don't think Benioff and Weiss would have ever handed control of the show's writing to anyone else, be that burnout or ego. The show suffered in terms of the quality of its writing as a result. The reason I wanted to make this video is because the loss of potential of a properly adapted A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons still saddens me to this day, and I believe it was the single worst decision the show made. But what I wanted to point out, there genuinely is a lot of real practical issues that make adapting A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, as written by George R. R. Martin, really difficult logistically. So much so I can understand and sympathise why Benioff and Weiss might have felt that their hand was forced in some aspects of it. But at the end of the day, the buck does stop with them, and it was their call. And the end result of that was the disjointed final few seasons of A Game of Thrones.